If you have more than one kid, you probably already know this. Sibling conflict is never just about the toy or the seat in the car or the tone or who touched whose stuff. Now, it may all start there, sure, but it rarely stays there. Because when sibling conflict becomes constant, it does not just affect the two kids involved, it drains the whole house. It changes the whole tone. It taxes you and your wife. It raises everybody's baseline level of stress. And before long, you're not just parenting kids, you're managing the emotional weather system in your own home. Hi, I'm Dan Hayden, and this is episode 44 of the Positive Legacy Podcast for Christian Fathers. I'm titling this episode, When Sibling Conflict Drains the Whole House. This is a first part of a four-part series that I'm calling Leading at Home Under Pressure. And I'm building this series around some of the most common issues that dads have been bringing into coaching lately. These are not abstract issues. They're not just theory. This is real life. And this is real life that I'm seeing in my coaching. And quite frankly, as you'll hear from today's episode, in my own home. This is sibling conflict. It just wears everybody out. Tension with grandparents or extended family around caregiving. That's another issue that folks are dealing with. Or the pressure that a dad feels when he's coming home from work. He's just depleted. And his wife, who's been home alone with 4 young kids, also depleted. And how hard it can be just to stay present when work just keeps trying to follow you, into your family life, especially for those of us who work from home. So we're going to start where a lot of families, feel the pressure first and loudest. And like I introduced you to, siblings. Now, if your kids are young, this probably feels pretty concrete and pretty immediate. And if your kids are older, or you've got a mix of ages like we do, teenagers, middle schoolers, junior hires, this still matters because sibling conflict changes as our kids grow, but it doesn't magically disappear. It just gets more verbal, more subtle, or even just more emotionally layered. And if you only ever deal with it as sort of like noise management, you're going to miss the deeper leadership opportunity that it presents to you as a dad. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today. Not how to make your kids never fight. Come on now, that's just not going to happen, right? I want to talk about how dads can stop treating sibling conflict like an interruption to family life and start seeing it as one of the places where your family culture can really start to get formed. Because it does. Every repeated conflict in your home is teaching your kids something. It teaches them how power works or how frustration gets expressed. It can teach them how people get heard, or maybe it's just the loudest one who's always getting heard. It can teach them how hurt gets handled or how mistakes get repaired or not repaired in some cases. And it also teaches them how mom and dad respond when emotions get loud. Because to be frank, sometimes we don't always respond accordingly or how we would like. But, if you don't lead all of that on purpose, generally the strongest emotion in the room is going to start leading it for you. And, that's usually not a great plan. And I can tell you from our house, sibling conflict is never just about one thing. It takes different shapes all the time, especially as our kids get older. Sometimes it's just a personality collision, or sometimes it's stubbornness in the sense of scarcity. Sometimes it's friction that comes when one of our kids is growing and changing faster than the other one sort of knows how to handle it. Let me make that concrete. I'll share with you some examples. One of my teenage daughters and my son, it's incredible. They are so alike that they just get on each other's nerves, to the nth degree. They're constantly correcting each other. They're constantly nagging each other. They can pick at each other just over the smallest things. Sometimes it's at the dinner table. Billy, chew with your mouth closed. I am closing my mouth. Well, you have food in your mouth now and it's not closed. Bridget, stop looking at me. Well, I wasn't looking at him. Right. It's just like moments like that. It's just, it's like nails on a chalkboard for us. Right. And yet at times they can also be the best of friends. I remember a time we went to Disneyland as a family and, Abby and Hannah, they hooked up and they just went off on their own. And they have phones and they know the park perfectly well. So we felt totally safe with it all. And then the strangest thing happened, right? These two that are just so alike that they just grind on each other, Billy and Bridget. They got together and they're like, hey, and they took off for the day. So much so that Bridget started buying him stuff with her own money. So, it's like moments like that that really make all of this so interesting. Because Bridget's personality, she absolutely relishes every opportunity to coach and teach and mentor younger kids, including those of Billy's age. We can all see her leadership just growing leaps and bounds in all kinds of ways in those environments. And it's pretty special. But she almost has, and I've called her out on this several times and she still doesn't have an answer for me. She has zero patience with Billy. You know, who shares so many of her same endearing traits. And honestly, it sort of blows our mind sometimes. So what's happening there? On the surface, it looks like annoyance, but underneath, it's something more like a personality collision. Sometimes the people who are most like us can irritate us the most because they mirror back the things that we recognize immediately. And if you only treat it as, hey, look, you guys just need to stop bickering. Please just be quiet and just eat your dinner. Stuff like that. You're gonna, I miss the opportunities for leadership because what I really want, Bridget to learn in all of this is leadership is not just patience with strangers or younger kids that you volunteer to help. Leadership includes patience and empathy with people who annoy you the most, even if they're inside your own home. And that's just a much different lesson. And another example I'll shift to, it looks different. And yes, Bridget's involved in this one too. But Bridget's twin, Abby, she's very stubborn, right? And full disclosure, she gets that from me. But there are times when she absolutely outright just refuses to share her stuff, which, to be fair, most of the time she actually paid for with her own money, but she absolutely just refuses to share, with her sister at what always seem to be just the worst possible times, right? And usually this happens when Bridget is in a hurry, which, let's be honest, is almost always, right? She loves to test the clock. She'll forget something and need to borrow it quickly. Maybe it's mascara or maybe it's a water bottle. And Abby, she'll just flat out refuse, has no sympathy, no empathy whatsoever. Just, no, sorry, that's mine. And she's not even using it, which is really the most frustrating part, right? Now, again, on the surface, it looks like a fight and stubbornness over an object, but beneath it, there's a collision between urgency and that stubbornness. Because, help me out and that's mine. That's where that collision is taking place. And if I only handle that moment as, hey, come on, look, please just share. We got to get out the door. You know, again, I, I may or may not, this is Abby we're talking about. I may or may not get temporary compliance. Like, fine. But I missed the deeper issue. Because really what I want, I actually want them to learn is how generosity and flexibility, ownership and consideration, how those things work together inside of a family. And, there's another sort of third kind of friction that I've been observing lately. And that's it's, it's a little sadder, and it's more subtle. Our youngest daughter is Hannah. She's 13, and she and Billy have always been just really close because of how near they are in age, right? Growing up, it was always Abby and Bridget, right? We're sort of a monolith because, they were twins. And then, it was always Abby and Bridget and then Hannah, cut 3 years younger than they are. And then Billy was born, so sometimes Hannah's relationship with Billy is pretty motherly, right? And then sometimes it's more peer to peer because they are a little closer in age. But either way, is generally been just the two of them together. Very similar to the way I grew up too. But as Hannah gets older, we've noticed that she's starting to pull away from him in some ways, and that's normal. I know it is. But it's still I don't know. It's difficult to see sometimes, sometimes she'll still play with him, when she thinks nobody's looking or, her friends are off doing other things. Right. And honestly, those moments are still pretty cool to watch. because she exhibits a lot of patience with him, and willingness and giving of her time, to play whatever game that Billy wants to play, but the friction shows up when Billy, will often show up. He'll just make like a very simple request. It used to be fine in years past, and now Hannah she'll just turn him down flat, and it'll frustrate him. And that creates a lot of tension. And, if we're not thoughtful enough as parents, we can respond to that like it's just rejection or unkindness, which I don't think is the case. But really part of what's happening is there's just developmental drift, and she's maturing. Their relationship is changing, and Billy still wants that closest, that they had. He wants his best friend. And Hannah is just renegotiating sort of what that relationship looks like as she gets older. And that's real. And while I do believe she'll circle back, in many ways, eventually over time, as older siblings often do, shout out to my own, the friction in this season is still real and still worth leading. So right there in just those three examples, you can see that sibling conflict is not just one issue, right? It's not one script. It's not just, kids fight. Sometimes it's sameness without empathy, or it's stubbornness around possessions and, being in a hurry, or it's grief around changing closeness. If dads don't slow down enough to notice the difference, we'll tend to lead all of it the same way. Usually, with some combination of, hey, look, stop it, or enough, or okay, fine, just look, I don't care who started it, I'm going to end it, right? We've definitely heard it. We probably used that line. Or just, hey, guys, just go to your rooms, please. I remember at one point in time, as we were getting dinner ready and putting food on the table, we would just have one of either Billy or Bridget just leave the dining room until everybody could be in there, just so we could monitor those two. Sometimes, though, to be clear, you do need to stop the behavior immediately, because, safety matters, right? We talked about that in previous podcasts. Boundaries definitely matter. And I'm not against intervention, but if your only tools are refereeing and judging, your kids may learn how to stop temporarily without ever learning how to handle that conflict. And that's the issue, because your goal is not just acquire a house for the next 10 minutes. Your goal is to raise kids who know how to deal with tension and frustration, and things like unfairness or hurt, and learn to repair in ways that don't poison their relationships. And really, that's the long game that we're hoping for. And that takes leadership. And one of the first things I'd want you to notice is this: sibling conflict is often less about the surface issue and more about the system, of the home. Maybe one kid is tired, one kid feels overlooked, one knows how to get a reaction, right? Look at Billy. He definitely knows how to press some buttons. Maybe one is desperate for control, or like I said, one is maturing faster, than another relationship can really, easily absorb. And all of it is happening inside a house where we parents, we're also carrying that stress, right? So that means if you only address the incident, you may miss the climate. And that's a huge distinction, because some of our homes don't just have isolated sibling conflict. They have a family rhythm where irritation is always just below the surface. And if that's your house right now, I want to be clear in saying this. That does not mean you're failing. It does not mean something is asking for your attention. And if it's already hitting home for you, if you're thinking, yeah, this this sibling stuff is exhausting, and honestly, I don't think we're handling it very well. That's exactly the kind of thing I help dads sort through with my coaching. Not just what to say in the moment, but what the conflict is revealing about the larger emotional culture in your home. Yeah, so great. All sounds good. But where do you start? I think you start by shifting the question. Instead of asking, how do I get them to stop fighting? You ask, what do I want my kids to learn from conflict in this house? And that's a very different question. It's far more nuanced, right? Maybe your answer is, I want them to learn that frustration does not give you permission to be cruel. Let that one sink in. Maybe it's, I want them to learn that stronger personalities do not get to dominate the weaker ones. I want them to learn that hurt gets repaired, not ignored. I want them to learn that conflict is not the end of the relationship. I see this with Billy a lot sometimes too. He'll have He'll have a fight, with a friend at school, and he'll think that's it. I guess I'll never talk to that kid again. Um, that's not true, right? We all know that. We also want them to learn maybe how to tell the truth without becoming destructive. Those are culture shaping answers. And once you get clear on that, your response in the moment starts to change, because now you're not just trying to shut down the noise. You're trying to build good people. That means your role as dad becomes less make this stop right now at all costs, and more help this become a teachable moment without letting it become a destructive one. Now, again, I know that sounds nice in theory, but in real life, one kid is screaming, another is crying, and you haven't even finished your coffee, or you haven't even gotten dinner on the table yet. So let's bring this to the ground level. I think a lot of sibling conflict leadership comes down to 3 moves: interrupt, regulate, and coach. You interrupt their behavior, you help everyone regulate, then you coach what needs to happen next. Interrupt is obvious. No, you don't get to hit. No, you don't get to scream in someone's face like that. No, you don't get to keep escalating just because you're mad. That part is pretty straightforward. But a lot of dads skip too quickly from interrupting to lecturing. And if your kids are still emotionally flooded, they are not learning much from your words at all. They're mostly just absorbing your intensity. That's why regulation matters. Sometimes before you try to teach anything, you need to lower the temperature. You need to reset that nervous system. That may mean separating them for a few minutes. That may mean just getting everybody a glass of water, or sitting down instead of looming, over them. That may mean taking one breath before you say another word. And yes, sometimes the person who most needs the breath is you. That is very real. One of the hidden challenges of sibling conflict is that it often stacks on top of everything else. You're already tired. You're already mentally somewhere else. And or excuse me, and now here comes another eruption. That's why your calm in these moments matters so much. If you escalate with them, the whole moment gets harder to redeem. That's one reason I created, a free resource for dads for these moments. And I call it the 5-minute calm leadership reset. So if sibling conflict, transitions, or recurring home stress tend to knock you off center, that reset gives you a simple way to come back to yourself before you bring more static into the room. And you can grab that through the link in the show notes. My gift, no worries. Now, look, once the room sort of comes down a little bit, that's where the coaching can begin. And this is where I want to make a distinction. Coaching is not the same as cross-examining. Cross-examining, as you know, sounds like, all right, who started it? What happened? Well, then why did you do that? Coaching sounds more like, hey, listen, I want to better understand your perspective. And you let them sort of talk one at a time from their perspective, right? So, hey, talk to me about what happened from your perspective here. Or what were you feeling right before everything really just sort of got bigger? What do you wish you had done differently? What do you think your sibling, just insert a name, what do you think Billy needs from you right now? What needs to happen before we move on, we accept these things, and we move on? That kind of conversation does not excuse the behavior in any way. I want to be clear on that, but it does build ownership. And in the end, ownership is the goal for this. It's not shame. I tell my kids all this all the time. I don't want you to feel shame in this moment, and explain to them sort of my perspective, right? It's definitely not fear. And I will point that out. Hey, look, I think you're making this is happening out of fear. Because when a kid learns to say, I was frustrated, but I made it worse, that's growth. And when a kid learns to say, I felt ignored, but I still shouldn't have said that, also growth. And when a kid learns to say, I don't like what happened, but I know how to repair it, that is also growth. And if that kind of thing feels hard to create in your house right now, I totally get it. You're not alone. Trust me. This is one of the most common places dads tell me that they feel too reactive or sometimes even too checked out. They know they need to lead it better, but they're not always sure what it looks like in practice. Now, let's talk about something else that matters here. Not all sibling conflict is the same. I gave you three very different examples. Sometimes it's simple friction or age gap frustration or personality clash. I'm sure, you may be experiencing chronic competition. Sometimes one kid has figured out exactly how to poke the other one. Oh my goodness, can he start pushing buttons? And sometimes one kid feels unheard unless they become real loud. This happens all the time, especially at the dinner table. We've got four kids and they all want to share stories. Sometimes a relationship is just simply changing because one kid is growing up. If you respond to all that conflict with the exact same script, you're gonna miss that opportunity, and that's why discernment matters so much here. A 5-year-old pestering a 10-year-old needs different leadership than two teenagers, sniping at each other. A toddler meltdown with one older sibling is different than long brewing resentment between, kids who feel compared, overlooked, or misunderstood. A 13-year-old beginning to differentiate from her younger brother needs different leadership than a daughter refusing, to lend mascara to a sister, who's chronically running late. So yeah, consistency matters, but consistency doesn't mean sameness. It means your values stay the same, even if your approach adapts. That may sound like, hey, look, in this house, you remember those statements that we had a few episodes ago? In this house, you do not get to be cruel when you're frustrated. In this house, stronger doesn't mean louder. In this house, growing up does not give you permission to be dismissive. See that one all the time too. Those kinds of statements help anchor your leadership, because when you know what you're trying to build, you're less likely to get lost in the chaos of each incident. And honestly, if you don't know your own values around sibling conflict yet, that that may be the best place to start. Eh, Not, how do I finally get them to stop, but what kind of relational culture am I trying to build between these kids? That question is going to take you much further. Okay, now we've got to pay the bills, right? With a word from our sponsor. And like last week, guess what? I'm the sponsor. So if sibling conflict is one of those things that keeps hijacking the tone of your home and you want to handle it better than you currently are, that is exactly the kind of work I do with Christian dads every single week. I help fathers become calmer, clearer, and more intentional in recurring home stress points, just like this one. So if that sounds like something you need, grab a complimentary coaching call with me through the link in the show notes. All right, let's back to it. Hey, another thing I'd want dads to pay attention to is this. Your kids are not just learning how to fight with each other. They are learning what happens when someone in the family becomes difficult. That's deeper. Do we shame them? Do we isolate them? Do we label them? Do we protect one and scapegoat the other? Do we just force fake apologies? Or do we tell the truth, hold the line, and make repair possible? That matters because sibling conflict is often the first peer-like relationship your kids have. It's where they learn things like how to share space and how to handle unfairness and how to survive annoyance and how to live with someone who just does not think like they do. That is serious formation. And if you can see it that way, then conflict becomes more than a nuisance. It becomes one of the workshops where character gets built. Now, that does not mean you romanticize it either. It's this is still tiring. It's still repetitive and it can still be frustrating. But meaning helps. When you can see the purpose, you gain patience. One practical thing that may help is creating a very short, repeatable repair rhythm. Not a speech or a tribunal or not a sort of a dramatic forced reconciliation. Just something simple. What happened? What part was yours? What does your sibling need now? And what needs to change next time? That kind of rhythm gives your family language, and language matters, because if all your kids know is, hey, just stop it, they won't know what to do instead. But if they start hearing over and over again, tell the truth, own your part, repair the hurt, try again. Then over time, those phrases start becoming part of how your home works. And that's family culture. And trust me, it's not going to happen overnight. You're going to fail up front at first more than you'll win. And that's important too. Because if sibling conflict has been draining your whole house for months or years, one calmer response for dad is not going to instantly transform everything, but it can begin to change the trajectory. And that's how most meaningful leadership works. Not in one grand breakthrough, in repeated, steadier moments. So here's what I want you to do this week. Pick one recurring kind of sibling conflict in your house. Not every conflict, just one kind. Maybe it's bickering in the car. Maybe it's someone taking someone else's stuff all the time. Maybe it's one kid just constantly baiting the other. Just pick one. And then ask yourself, what do I want my kids to learn from this kind of conflict? What is my usual response? And what would interrupt, regulate, and coach look like instead in this moment? That's enough. You do not have to solve your entire family dynamic in one week. In fact, you're not gonna. But if you can lead one recurring conflict a little more intentionally, you will begin shifting the tone of your home. And if you realize, as you think about it, that sibling conflict is not just exhausting, but actually shaping your whole household in ways you just don't like and you never intended for, don't ignore that. That's a meaningful signal. So inside my Positive Legacy Academy, this is the kind of thing we work on in real life. How to stop overreacting and instead respond. How to reduce household pressure without lowering the standards. Remember, boundaries are still important. How to respond to recurring conflict with more clarity. And how to build a family culture where honesty, responsibility, and repair, they're actually practiced. Look, we're not perfect. I don't have all the answers. But boy, we can really help with this stuff. So if that sounds like the kind of support you need, I'd love to invite you again to a complimentary coaching call. On that call, we can talk about what kind of sibling conflict is wearing your family out the most, how you've been responding, what kind of culture you want to build instead. And whether coaching with me and a group of other Christian dads would help you lead, in those moments, just that much more intentionally. If you want to book a call, go for it. You can grab a time through the link in the show notes. Hey, sibling conflict is not just about getting through the next argument. It's about shaping the kind of people your kids are becoming while they live under your roof. As you look at your home this week, where is sibling conflict draining the whole house? And what do you most want your kids to learn there instead? Until next time, stay rooted in grace, stay steady in mind and spirit, and keep building your positive legacy one intentional moment at a time. Talk to you again next week. Thanks.